Oh, how far we have come. This is Terrible Dactyl, and this is another episode of Jurassic Plastic. Today, as you can see, we're going to take a look at the new PNSO prehistoric animal models that accompany your growth. Is that the name of this line? I guess it is. This is from their medium-sized dinosaur line, and this is the new Stegosaurus, like PNSO does. They give this one a name. This is number 14. Bieber the Stegosaurus. Okay. Cool. This is the box that it comes in. There's some text on the bottom, product information, and we have a lovely little line drawing here on the top. You can see that the sculptor of this is Xiao Chang, and a well-known paleo artist who does a lot of the PNSO, or possibly all of the PNSO models. And it comes in this lovely little box with a photo of Bieber the Stegosaurus right there on the front. But let's take a look at the actual model. There it is. Look at this thing. Now, I have to say, everybody, that people ask me what my favorite dinosaur is. I kind of have to go with Stegosaurus. I actually own more Stegosaurus models and toys and things than any other dinosaur. Not because I went out of my way to get them. I guess just because it's a very common choice in dinosaur lines. There's always multiple Stegosauruses or Stegosauri. As a big Stegosaurus fan, I'm going to go out on a limb and, spoiler alert, this is the best Stegosaurus available right now. Now, no offense to you Safari fans, and I know I've got many of you considering that this channel focuses on Safari, but look at this Stegosaurus, guys. It is beautiful. It's got multiple layers of paint here. The color choice is really classic. It's got that orangey red and green that was first popularized by Charles Knight in one of his very first Stegosaurus paintings. I don't know about one of his very first Stegosaurus paintings, but one of the very first Stegosaurus paintings that existed had that classic red and green paint scheme. So it is a little bit cliche to do this red and green pattern, but I don't mind that. I think this is like the canon look for a Stegosaurus, and I do appreciate it when companies go out of their way to change that up. Like I said in my review of the Carnegie Collection Stegosaurus models, I really like what they did with their, kind of creamsicle orange and white colored Stegosaurus. But if you're going to do a definitive Stegosaurus, come on, it's got to be this color scheme, doesn't it? And they did go out of their way to mix it up. They've got all these beautiful black details and highlights all along each plate, the mottled brown stripes all along its body, and even down to the detail on the thagomizer here. Every inch of this is painted, except maybe, I'm not sure what the base color paint is here. Is it a white base color? Probably. This whitish creamish color, but either way it looks like it's fully painted. And the layering, the washes that were applied to this, for a smallish 1/30 scale model, the detailing in the paint and the detailing in the sculpt, you really can't beat it for a kind of a hard, slightly rubbery vinyl model like this. Obviously, if you go higher end and get a resin model or something like that, you're going to find things that match or exceed this. But for the price point, for the scale in terms of plastic dinosaur models, this is the best Stegosaurus you're going to find. Let me point out some of the things that I particularly love about this model. First of all, look how wide it is. Thyreophorian armored dinosaurs were wide. Most of them, particularly the ankylosaurs, but sometimes you don't quite get the impression from toys like this of how wide something like Stegosaurus is. Look how broad the hips are here. And you can see why early reconstructions of this animal showed the plates more widely spaced. I believe based on the work of people like Ken Carpenter and some more recent scientists who have been looking at Stegosaurus, that this is more correct. Not quite a single row of plates, but slightly offset staggered row of plates like that is probably what we would have been looking at in the real animal. And even down to the texture on the skin, it has very, very fine scales all across the entire body, in addition to these really leathery looking wrinkles on the skin, and they kind of complement each other. This is something that the later Carnegie models by Forrest Rogers were very good at, combining just a little bit of texturing, which you don't want too big texture details on an animal of this scale, because obviously dinosaur scales, with the exception of things like ceratopsians, were tiny. But these look appropriate to a 1/30 scale. You can just barely see some of these scales until you get to the larger ossicles here, or larger feature scales here along the flank, the top of the hip, and you can see some larger scales even here under the throat that kind of correspond to the bony armor that would have underlain the skin on the throat here. Now obviously the paint application that I was praising earlier is not perfect on this model, especially when it gets to the front plates and around the eye. They probably could have done a slightly better job detailing these. They're a little bit simply painted, a little too obviously airbrushed in those details, and it would have been nice to see a little bit more detail here around the beak rather than just have it continue to be skin color. Not that that's necessarily inaccurate, but it would have been nice just to highlight some of the different skin textures that probably did exist on the head, which is wonderful and small, triangular the way it should be. The neck is possibly slightly too long for Stegosaurus. I know a lot of more recent Stegosaurus reconstructions are based on the more complete skeletons of Hesperosaurus, which does have a long neck, and obviously we've got Stegosaurs like Miragaia, which may be the same thing as Dacentrurus, but that do have very long necks. I'm not sure if a Stegosaurus stenops, which this is, based on the anatomy of the tail plates here, which are very round, I'm not sure if the neck would have been necessarily that long. You know that Stegosaurus ungulatus seems to have at least a slightly shorter neck based on some of the specimens that they have at Yale. The Yale specimen that they have mounted of Stegosaurus ungulatus is a composite, but I believe that the vertebral column is complete enough to tell that it did have a slightly shorter than usual neck, not as short as it's often depicted. The shortness of Stegosaurus necks in classic art tend to be because of the misplacement of the shoulder girdle. They just put that shoulder girdle too far forward, leaving very few vertebrae to make up the neck. This one is appropriately pushed back to make this small, rounded central body here. And then obviously we've got the tail, which, just as in Ken Carpenter's paper, points out that it emerges from the hip at a slightly upward angle and then will go out. Now, I have seen criticism online of people saying that this tail just droops too much, which seems to be based on this dinosaur Renaissance era idea of anti-gravity tails. The tail of Stegosaurus, past about 1/3, should have been relatively flexible, and the only reason that the first third would not have been too flexible is because it contains the attachment for those leg motion muscles, the caudofemoralis, which goes from the femur into the tail. So this region is appropriately bulky. I would say that the connection between the hip, which is very wide, and the base of the tail could even be bulkier between here and there. If I had to nitpick this, I would say give it a nice fat base of the tail just to show how strong this tail would have been. But the droopiness of the tail past that, I don't think there's anything inaccurate with that. As far as I know, Stegosaurus did not have any ossified tendons or things in here that would have kept this part of the tail straight. And indeed, if it was going to be using this to attack predators, you kind of think it should be relatively flexible, unless it was going to go in the opposite direction and get totally reinforced into basically a stick with a club at the end, the way that Ankylosaurus had. Now, obviously, this tail, when it was standing, even if it drooped all the way down, the tip of the tail would barely be capable of touching the ground here. In a lot of the old reconstructions with the sloped tail dragging stegosaurs, like in our old friend from the British Museum Invicta line here, you can see the main difference is that that hip is actually tilted up so that the tail does emerge straight from the hip, but it's at a downward angle that causes it to drag. Now, that hip arrangement, as far as I know, is not supported by more recent evidence, so this one is spot on in terms of the shape of the hip. The other criticism I've seen of this particular model online compares it to the recent Safari model of Stegosaurus, which is a much larger model, and don't get me wrong, it is a beautiful model. It's very, very well sculpted. But one thing that people point out is that the Safari model is based on the most complete Stegosaurus specimen in the world, which is the Sophie specimen at the British Museum. Obviously, this was not based on that. But that one has a much straighter back. This one has the classic arched back that you used to see in old Stegosaurus reconstructions. If you imagine the neck coming more up from here and the front limbs pushed back to where they should be, this would have that classic arched back too. And people are saying, well, you know, it looks a little too old school. But I would invite you to take a look at the even newer, the brand new mount that they just put up in the redone Smithsonian Museum dinosaur gallery of their Stegosaurus, which is the holotype of Stegosaurus stenops, probably the exact same one that this model is based on, and we know that thanks to the large plates. That one has a arch to the back that almost exactly matches this one. Now, I was thinking, what's going on? Which of these is more accurate? Well, as far as I can tell, they're both accurate. The primary difference seems to be that the Sophie specimen lacks tall neural spines within the back. I can't tell if it necessarily lacks them or if they just mounted it with the plates down on the side of the neural spines instead of coming up off the top of the neural spines. If they're coming up off the top of the neural spines, that would imply that there's a tall ridge between the plates. I'm not sure which is the case. I'd have to look at that Sophie description a little bit more carefully to find that out. But either way, you can see the difference in those two mounts. The Smithsonian Mount has much, much taller neural spines and then the plates situated on top. And if you compare the outline of the back in that mounted specimen, which just debuted this year, it's not like it's out of date, it was just remounted, it does have a tall arched back, just like a classic Stegosaurus. So there's two explanations that I can think of for the differences between this one and Safari's model of Sophie. One of them is just a difference in the way that those two skeletons were mounted. Another explanation could just be ontogeny. The Sophie specimen is actually really small. You wouldn't know that from the immense size of that new Safari model. But Sophie is a small stegosaur. It's much smaller than the holotype mount. And it could just be that it's young. The plates are smaller. They're noticeably smaller. The back is straighter because it's got lower neural spines and or because it was mounted differently with the plates in relation to the neural spines. Either way, I don't think that you can use Sophie to claim that this PNSO model is in any way inaccurate. From my knowledge of Stegosaurus, now I'm not saying I'm an expert, but I am saying that Stegosaurus is my favorite classic dinosaur, and I have done quite a bit of research on Stegosaurus independently. I think that this is almost 100% accurate. I'd say this is 95% accurate, and so is the Safari one. From what I can tell, the differences are simply either individual variation, differences in interpretation of the evidence, or ontogeny, changes through its growth cycle. And I I don't think you can say that one is more or less accurate than the other. I do have to say that in a way I do prefer this model. I think it's gorgeously painted. I think the detailing is extremely well done, and from a distance it just looks like a living, breathing animal to me. So for my money, like I said, you know, for its time, this old Invicta was the best Stegosaurus around. And I'm not going to do a full review of the Invicta here, but this is my favorite. Look at the skin stretched here. They really paid good attention to detail on these models. And this one is the modern day version of that. I think that this is not only the most accurate Stegosaurus on the market right now, but probably the most accurate that's ever been made. And barring some fairly significant reinterpretation of the Stegosaurus evidence or discovery of even more complete specimens, I think this is as good as it's going to get for a while, guys. So that is the PNSO Stegosaurus. I think this is officially my very first review on my channel that is not for a safari dinosaur. So if you are okay with that, if you liked this review, if you're interested in more different modern lines like this, PNSO models and things like that, if you'd like to see more reviews like this, please let me know in the comments. If you want to argue with me about how accurate this is in comparison to Safari's Sophie model, or if you are a Stegosaurus expert and you think I've got something grossly wrong in my explanation of why I think this is the most accurate Stegosaurus on the market, I am definitely open to correction. So please let me know in the comments, and make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can keep getting more videos from Jurassic Plastic. And I will see you next time.